My 3 rules have not changed. 1, you can't kill me in a movie. 2, I have to win all my fights in a movie. 3, I get the girl if I want her.
Before Hollywood posters, before blaxploitation legends, before the nickname The Hammer echoed through stadiums and movie theaters, there was a black boy growing up in a divided America that never planned to make room for him. Fred "The Hammer" Williamson was born on March 5th, 1938 in Gary, Indiana, an industrial city shaped by steel mills, smoke-filled skies, and invisible racial borders that determined how far you were allowed to go. His father, Frank Williamson, worked as a welder. His mother, Lydia, was a seamstress. They weren't starving, but they weren't protected either. What Fred learned early was simple and brutal. If you didn't fight for yourself, no system was coming to save you. In the 1940s and 1950s, Gary was rigidly segregated. Whites-only signs weren't subtle suggestions. They were law, culture, and consequence. When Fred's family later moved to East Chicago, he often found himself as one of the only black students in class. Respect wasn't given. It had to be taken. And Fred took it. He fought back, verbally, physically, instinctively. Teachers labeled him difficult. Other kids labeled him trouble. But beneath that fire was something most people missed: discipline, intelligence, and raw athletic power. A PE teacher finally saw what society refused to acknowledge. Fred wasn't reckless. He was gifted. Sports became the one place where prejudice paused, if only briefly. On the track, the basketball court, and especially the football field, strength mattered more than skin color. Fred excelled, not just as muscle, but as a thinker. At the same time, he showed a talent for math and technical drawing, developing a fascination with architecture, an unusual interest for a working-class black kid in the Midwest during that era. That combination, physical dominance and intellectual sharpness, earned him a scholarship to Northwestern University, one of the most prestigious schools in the country. For Fred, it wasn't just admission. It was penetration through a wall America had built to keep men like him out. At Northwestern, Fred studied architecture while starring on the football team. His confidence, charisma, and presence earned him a nickname that followed him everywhere: Hollywood Fred. Even then, people could sense he was operating on a larger frequency than the system expected. But the NFL wasn't ready for a man like Fred Williamson. In the early 1960s, professional football was still deeply segregated in mindset. Black players were tolerated, but rarely trusted in leadership-heavy defensive roles, strategy, authority, intimidation. Those positions were unofficially reserved for white players. Fred shattered that unspoken rule. When he joined the Oakland Raiders in 1961, he didn't ease into the league. He attacked it. He hit harder, played faster, and brought an intensity that made coaches uncomfortable and opponents afraid. His tackles weren't just stops, they were statements. So violent, so decisive, that teammates jokingly complained he was hammering everyone, including them. The nickname stuck. Fred "The Hammer" Williamson wasn't a marketing creation. It was survival branding. He carried that identity to the Kansas City Chiefs, where he fully exploded into legend status. In an era when black players were told to stay quiet and grateful, Fred became louder, prouder, and more visible. He didn't just play football, he performed dominance. 3 straight AFL All-Star selections, a reputation that followed him onto every field. By 1966, he helped lead the Kansas City Chiefs to the AFL Championship, earning a spot in what would become the first Super Bowl in history. But statistics alone don't explain why Fred Williamson became unforgettable. What truly terrified the NFL was that Fred refused to be controlled. He invented his own signature move, the forearm hammer strike, a brutal backward blow that slammed into helmets with a sound so loud the crowd could hear it crack through the stadium. Fans gasped, opponents panicked, the league fined him repeatedly, and Fred smiled every time because every fine made him more famous. Then came Super Bowl I, January 1967. With the entire nation watching, Fred stood in front of microphones and did something America wasn't prepared for. He spoke boldly. "I'm going to knock out both of Green Bay's receivers," he declared. "One hammer for Dowler, one for Dale." A black man publicly threatening white football heroes on national television. The media exploded. The fear was real. The fascination was unavoidable. Fate intervened cruelly. Fred was injured early in the game and carried off the field on a stretcher. Some thought that was the end of his moment. They were wrong. As he was taken away, the crowd chanted his name, "The Hammer." That was the moment Fred Williamson stopped being just an athlete. He became a symbol, and symbols don't retire quietly. By the time Fred Williamson stepped into professional football, it was clear he was never meant to blend in. The NFL of the early 1960s was a tightly controlled, deeply segregated system where black athletes were expected to follow orders, stay quiet, and accept whatever role they were given. Leadership positions, especially in defense, were quietly reserved for white players. Intelligence, authority, and aggression were coded as white traits. Fred Williamson shattered that myth the moment he put on a uniform. Standing nearly 6'3", weighing over 215 pounds, Fred entered the league not asking for permission, but demanding space. In 1961, he joined the Oakland Raiders, a team that already carried a rebellious image, but even there, his style was considered extreme. Fred didn't just tackle, he attacked. His hits were violent, precise, and intentional. Coaches warned him repeatedly to tone it down. Teammates joked nervously. Opponents feared him. That fear soon had a name. During practice, Fred was told to stop hammering his own teammates during drills. The word stuck. The hammer wasn't a nickname meant to flatter. It was a warning. When Fred took the field, he played like every snap was personal. And in a league that was still uncomfortable with black men expressing dominance, his confidence felt threatening. When Fred later joined the Kansas City Chiefs, his reputation followed him. Defensive backs were not supposed to intimidate entire offenses, but Fred did exactly that. He wasn't just defending passes, he was enforcing territory. Quarterbacks rushed throws, receivers flinched before contact, fans leaned forward every time number 24 moved. But what truly separated Fred Williamson from every other player of his era wasn't just his physicality, it was his mouth. Fred understood something most athletes didn't. Attention was power. He didn't shy away from cameras. He didn't soften his tone for reporters. He spoke boldly, confidently, and sometimes provocatively, especially before Super Bowl I in January 1967. With the entire nation watching, Fred stood in front of microphones and made a declaration that shocked America. I'm going to knock out both of Green Bay's receivers. 2 hammers for Dowler, 1 for Dale. No black athlete had ever spoken like that on a national stage. White audiences were stunned. The media framed him as arrogant, dangerous, out of control. But black audiences saw something different, a man who refused to shrink. When the game began, Fred flew across the field exactly as promised. He struck hard, fast, and without hesitation. But fate turned cruel. In a violent collision early in the game, Fred was injured and carried off the field on a stretcher. The cameras followed him as fans chanted his name. In that moment, something unexpected happened. Fred Williamson became a legend. Not because he won the Super Bowl, he didn't. Not because he delivered on every threat, he couldn't. But because he dared. He dared to speak. He dared to challenge. He dared to exist loudly in a system that preferred black excellence silent. Over his 8-year professional career, Fred played 104 games and recorded 36 interceptions, numbers that placed him among the league's elite defenders. With the Oakland Raiders alone, he logged 25 interceptions in just 56 games. But statistics never told the full story. What Fred left behind was far bigger than numbers. He changed how athletes understood fame. Fred wasn't just playing football, he was branding himself. The hammer wasn't a nickname the league gave him, it was an identity he claimed. Every fine the NFL handed him for illegal hits only amplified his image. Every criticism made him more famous. Fans didn't come just to watch the game, they came to see Fred Williamson, but fame without control is a trap. Fred realized that no matter how feared or celebrated he became, the NFL still owned his body, his image, and his future. The league made money off his violence while punishing him for expressing it. That contradiction was not lost on him. In 1967, at the peak of his notoriety, Fred Williamson did something almost unthinkable. He walked away. Not because he couldn't play, not because he wasn't dominant, but because he understood something early. If you don't control your image, someone else will. And Fred Williamson was never built to be controlled. Football had made him famous, but it was about to become the blueprint for something much bigger. Hollywood was next, and Fred Williamson wasn't going there to audition, he was going there to take over. By the early 1970s, Fred the Hammer Williamson had done something almost unheard of for a black man in America at the time. He walked away from the NFL on his own terms and stepped into Hollywood believing the same rules of domination applied. Strength, presence, control. But Hollywood didn't see him as a hero. They saw him as muscle, a body, a threat that didn't fit neatly into their scripts. Studios wanted Fred to play criminals who died early, nameless henchmen, villains whose sole purpose was to be defeated by white leads. Fred refused, quietly at first, then openly. He made 3 rules that became legendary in casting offices. His character would not die on screen, he would not lose a fight, and if there was a woman in the story, he would not be humiliated or erased. These weren't ego demands, they were political. In an industry that still treated black men as disposable, Fred was rewriting the image from the inside out. Television came first. Appearances on Ironside, Star Trek, Mission, Impossible, Julia. Each role mattered, not because they paid well, but because they placed a black man in positions of authority, intelligence, and power on screens that had rarely allowed it. But TV wasn't enough. Fred wanted ownership, control, legacy. Then came Hammer in 1972. The title alone felt like a declaration. Fred wasn't just acting, he was branding himself. Audiences responded immediately. For black viewers especially, this wasn't just entertainment, it was recognition. Someone who looked like them wasn't begging for dignity, he was taking it. But Black Caesar in 1973 changed everything. Fred Williamson didn't just play Tommy Gibbs. He embodied a fantasy born from rage, ambition, and historical exclusion. A black man rising through a corrupt system and ending up on top. Not as a sidekick, not as comic relief, but as the boss. The film was controversial, loud, violent, and unapologetic. Critics hated it. Audiences packed theaters. The message was clear. Hollywood might not like this image, but Black America embraced it. The sequel, Hell Up in Harlem, arrived the same year and confirmed it wasn't luck. Fred Williamson had become one of the biggest stars of the blaxploitation era, but success came with backlash. By the late 1970s, the same industry that profited from these films began turning on them. Media labeled the genre dangerous. Activists criticized its violence. Studios pulled funding. Distribution dried up. Overnight, black action heroes were considered liabilities. Fred saw what was coming, and he refused to wait for permission to survive. Instead of begging Hollywood to let him stay, he left. He moved his operation to Italy and founded Po' Boy Productions, taking full control of his work. Writing, directing, producing, editing, financing. Films like Boss Nigger, Mr. Mean, Death Journey. They weren't polished by Hollywood standards, but they were free. Fred wasn't asking to be included anymore. He had built his own table. For over 2 decades, Po' Boy Productions generated dozens of films. Fred became something far more dangerous to the system than a movie star. He became independent, a black man owning his image, his labor, and his narrative. He didn't need Oscars. He had an audience, he had leverage, and most importantly, he had autonomy. That independence is exactly why Fred was never fully embraced by mainstream Hollywood again. And then came the Oprah moment. When Fred publicly stated that Oprah Winfrey did not represent real black artists like him, artists who fought, bled, and broke doors open, the industry went cold. Oprah wasn't just a media figure, she was a gatekeeper, and Fred had just challenged the gate itself. Invitations stopped, coverage faded. His name slowly disappeared from polite Hollywood conversations. But Fred didn't walk it back. He never apologized. He had never survived by pleasing power. What many don't understand is that Fred Williamson was never chasing approval. He was chasing truth. And truth comes with consequences. Lawsuits followed him, accusations, rumors about his intensity on set, claims that working with him was dangerous, some of it exaggerated, some of it real. Fred believed action should feel real, and sometimes people got hurt. That reputation stuck. By the time accusations surfaced later in his life, Fred was already a symbol too complex to simplify. Hero, rebel, pioneer, problem, legend. He was all of it at once. And still, he never disappeared. When Hollywood finally realized it could no longer control Fred, the Hammer Williamson, it did what it has always done best. It turned its back. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, the blaxploitation wave that once made him a box office force was suddenly labeled problematic. Studios pulled funding, distribution dried up. The same industry that once profited off black rebellion now wanted cleaner, safer images. And Fred, unapologetic and unmoving, refused to soften himself to survive. So he did what few actors, especially black actors at the time, dared to do. He left. Fred moved his production base to Italy, a place that welcomed his intensity rather than feared it. There, he became something even more dangerous to Hollywood than a rebellious star, an independent filmmaker. Through his company, Po' Boy Productions, Fred wrote, directed, produced, and starred in his own films. He controlled the scripts. He controlled the money. He controlled the final cut. No studio notes. No executives telling him how black men should behave on screen. Films like Boss Nigger, Mr. Mean, Death Journey, and others weren't polished studio products. They were raw, aggressive, and unapologetic, and they sold. Not because critics approved, but because audiences showed up. Fred didn't need Oscars, he needed freedom. Over the decades, Po' Boy Productions was involved in more than 30 films. Fred became one of the earliest black filmmakers to truly own his work end to end. Long before independent cinema became fashionable, Fred Williamson was living it, financing his own projects, negotiating his own deals, and answering to no one. But independence has a price. Fred was outspoken, and that made powerful enemies. His public criticism of Oprah Winfrey in the early 2000s became a turning point. While many saw Oprah as the ultimate symbol of black success, Fred believed her version of representation excluded men like him. Bold, confrontational, and unwilling to be palatable. When he said publicly, "She doesn't represent us, not the real us," the consequences were immediate. Invitations stopped, media coverage dried up, Hollywood doors quietly closed. Fred knew exactly what he was doing. He understood that speaking truth in a system built on image management comes with exile, and he accepted it without regret. "Hollywood didn't make me," he said. "They needed me." That wasn't arrogance, it was ownership. Controversy followed him into later years. In 2019, accusations of inappropriate behavior surfaced from a former assistant. Fred denied them firmly, and no criminal conviction followed, but the headlines added complexity to a legacy already filled with confrontation. Fred never presented himself as flawless. He presented himself as real, and reality is rarely clean. Away from the noise, Fred lived a quieter life. He settled in Palm Springs with his wife Linda, whom he married in 1988, a marriage that endured decades. Unlike the hyper-masculine characters he played, his real life was guarded and private. His children stayed out of the spotlight. Fame was his. Peace belonged to his family. There was another side to Fred few talked about. In 2013, he quietly worked with the Wounded Warrior Project, supporting veterans dealing with physical and psychological trauma. No press tour, no brand deals, just action. For a man known for violence on screen, his real-life compassion ran deep, especially for those broken by systems larger than themselves. In his later years, Fred chose Chicago over Los Angeles. Not retreat, refusal. He rejected Hollywood's obsession with relevance and visibility. He kept working, kept producing, kept appearing in films like VFW, 2019, proving age would not erase him. Fred Williamson didn't chase legacy, he built it. He showed black artists that power doesn't come from approval. It comes from ownership, that you don't need permission to be central, that you can be feared, respected, and uncontained. Without Fred Williamson, there is no Wesley Snipes kicking down doors in Blade. No Denzel Washington commanding moral authority on screen. No Samuel L. Jackson turning intensity into art. The Hammer didn't just entertain, he shifted the center of gravity. Fred Williamson is not a footnote, he is a blueprint. A man who refused to bend, a man who chose control over comfort, a man who proved that sometimes the most powerful legacy isn't how loudly the world applauds you, but how firmly you stand when it turns away. And that's why, decades later, his name still hits hard. The Hammer didn't fade. He stepped aside on his own terms. Fred, the Hammer, Williamson was never built to be controlled. Not by the NFL, not by Hollywood, not by public opinion. He carved his legacy with his own hands, on the field, on the screen, and behind the camera, proving that real power isn't given, it's taken. Some call him controversial, others call him fearless. But one thing is undeniable. Fred Williamson changed the game and refused to disappear. Now we want to hear from you. Was Fred Williamson a rebel or a trailblazer? A misunderstood icon or a man too real for the system? Drop your thoughts in the comments. If this story gave you a new perspective, hit like, subscribe for more untold legends, and share this video with someone who respects real history. Because legends only live on when their stories are remembered.